Good evening and a very warm welcome from a very windy Leeds on behalf of Millim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm delighted to welcome viewers in Canada, in Ireland, in Israel and other places all around the globe. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Ashley Millett Martin, and I will introduce Ashley in just a moment. Now, we are dedicating this evening's programme to the memory of the late Stuart Wolfe. Stuart was part of the behind-the-scenes team here at Millim, and he sadly passed away just a few days ago. In fact, he was working on our programmes as recently as last week. We all mourn his loss and send our condolences to his family. We will miss you, Stuart. Now, on to tonight's talk, and please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we'll try to get through as many of your questions and comments as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility, which allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this talk is being recorded and it will be visible on our website at millim.org.uk, where you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our exciting future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Ashley Millett Martin is an award-winning career journalist of more than 40 years standing. He wrote for local newspapers about the UK car and van fleet and was editor of the weekly Fleet News for more than 7 years. Latterly, he ran his own PR business and wrote books, including The Fleet Guide to Low Emission Vehicles. He's also the great-grandson of Israel Marcus Millett, also known as Max, who started the family business known as Millett Brothers in Bristol. Almost 2 years ago, Ashley retired and thought he would pick up a project that he'd actually started some 35 years earlier. He mentions a file marked Millets, which had been on the shelf in his home office, staring at him for the past 20 years. The result is this book, Army Surplus, Workers and Campers, Millets, The History of a High Street Institution. And that is what we have the pleasure of discussing this evening. So Ashley, a very warm Millim welcome to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan. It's good to be with you and everyone else, wherever you're listening in the UK and overseas.
Now, I often ask authors how long it's taken to complete their work. I think 35 years must be a record. Why did it take so long?
Well, it took a long time, Jonathan, because I started full of enthusiasm and what have you in the mid 80s when I was training as a journalist or newly qualified as a journalist, and this was obviously the pre-internet days, pre-email, and I thought it would be quite an interesting project to do in my spare time to find out about the history of the business. As a young boy, and I'm talking about 5 or 6 years old, I'd stay at my grandparents, who in those days lived in Streatham in London, and my grandfather still worked in one of the Millet shops that he owned, which was the one in Lewisham in South London, and I used to go with Grandpa to the shop, and I suppose it was my first Saturday job as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old or thereabouts, and I just sort of had memories of those days, I suppose, and Millets. Every time I walked past the Millet shop, my home city is Peterborough, and I'd see it, and I thought it'd be quite an interesting project to research the history. So I rang up, as I say, pre-internet days, pre-email, so I used to ring up aged aunts and uncles, go and see some of them and get bits of and quiz them on interview them on their memories of the Millet shop and the Millet shops, and for the most part they were all very helpful and very interested in the project, but I suppose I probably did about 70%, 75% of the workload. Typed it all up, as I say, no computers in those days, so it was a good old typewriter and shorthand note taking, type my notes up, and then I'd go along and do the next chapter and interview some more aged aunts and uncles and anyone else I could get hold of, one or two ex-employees or employees as well. But then I sort of, as I say, having done about 75–80% perhaps of the workload, there was odd sectors of the family who perhaps were, I wouldn't, didn't respond to my interest, shall we say, and career took off and other things, life, I suppose. And I thought, well, if I can't do research in 100%, then I won't bother. So I just left it in a folder on a shelf. But when I retired from work in March 22, this folder in my home office had been marked Millets history, had been sort of staring at me. And I decided to resurrect the project. And as I say, probably with about 20% of it, 25% of it left to do. A lot of stuff now online. We were back in the internet age. I got in touch also through email with and ultimately spoke to two or three distant cousins, third cousins, I think, possibly living, one of them, Julian Millet, living in Israel. I'm not sure if Julian's listening, tuned in tonight, and also Richard Cooper, and I have to pay tribute to Richard, who I think is also tuned in, who ran his own millets business, or that took on the family business. But I owe Richard a debt of thanks for the genealogy that he provided. Richard's the unofficial millets genealogist, I think. And so anyway, with interviews, with online research, lots of newspapers in the British Newspaper Society archive available online, I was able to build up a picture of the areas of the millets family business that I didn't know too much about, and pulled it together and decided, well, that's about as far as it's going to get. No one else, to the best of my knowledge, has researched it. So I finished it off, and about 10 months ago now, decided that was as far as it was going to go, and published the book, funded the printing and what have you myself. And the end result is what we're talking about tonight. Yeah.
Okay, so we have viewers all around the world. Some of them will be expats, some of them won't be. So in a nutshell, for people who don't know, what is Millets?
Well, today Millets is an outdoor store. It's owned by a company that some people might know called JD Sports. They're a FTSE 100 company, big into the outdoor market, particularly the sports market, but they do own Millets, selling camping equipment, walking equipment, rucksacks, sleeping bags, everything for the great outdoors. And indeed, they bill themselves as Millets, the outdoor store. And ultimately, that is what Millets, when it was family owned, they did get into the camping and the outdoor space. But the business started by, as you said, Jonathan, my great grandfather, Israel Marcus Millet, but always known as Max, and he opened his first shop, which was known as Millets Brothers, at 9 Newfoundland Street in Bristol in 1893, and that was described as a wholesale and retail drapers and haberdashers. So completely different to the business that it is today. And there's, but even so, although best part of 130 years, 129 years on from when my great grandfather started, there's still, I think, 94 millet shops in towns and cities across the UK.
Now, is Millets with one T or two T's?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I suppose that there is no I can't give you a definitive answer despite my research. In the eyes of the public, there's probably only ever been one Millets, because, and we'll come on to the ownership structure as in a little while perhaps, but Millets, some branches of Millets were spelt with one T and some branches were spelt with two. The family name, when is of one T, was one T, Millet. Although researching my direct family's history, on the birth certificate of Israel Marcus is actually spelt double T. and but the business that he owned, which ultimately became J.M. Millet and Sons, and there's a story there why it was J.M. Millet and not I.M. Millet. But J.M. Millet and Sons was one of the businesses. There was also Millet of Bristol Holdings and Millet Brothers, and they were the three businesses that with one T. The rest of them were all Millets with double T, so spelled MILLETTS. Why was that? Well, there are various family stories as to why that might have been. The one that I won't bore you with them all, but the one that I particularly like was that well, there's two actually. One of them that it was a sign writer's mistake. He couldn't read whether it was one T or two, so he put two T's up, and that stuck. The other one is that it was some members of the family thought that spelling it with two T's was more English than with one T. So, you know, you pay your money and you take your choice, I suppose, but I can't give you a definitive answer. What the story, but the ultimate story that I think is a great one is, and just probably shows the way that businessmen think, is many years after my family started the businesses, a UK conglomerate called Sears, which owned some 4,000 high street shops, bought and owned a lot of the Millets stores. And when their chairman at the time was a chap called Geoffrey Maitland-Smith, and in 1986, which was when they bought the vast majority of the shops, having already owned about 60, when he was asked whether it would be spelt Millets with one T or two, his answer in the Financial Times was, "We'll spell it with one T, it makes the shop fronts cheaper."
So your great-grandfather opened this shop in Bristol, and you said it was drapers, haberdashers, but he was selling some quite interesting things that were not perhaps available elsewhere. What sort of things would one find in this store?
Well, the big they started off. My grandfather was they were a family of 11 children. Israel Marcus was the third. There were seven boys and 4 girls, and my grandfather was the third oldest of the boys. But I think it's acknowledged that he was very much the leader in terms of the business. And when they arrived in the UK, in England, having sort of been in Ireland for a little while, eventually they found their way to Bristol and then on to Southampton. And both of them, and Southampton particularly, were ports where soldiers would return to the UK. And in those days it was the Boer War, and they used to go to the docks and buy up army surplus, which was basically unwanted army kit, and they'd hawk that around the streets of Southampton, probably door to door, and selling some other stuff as well, tablecloths and the like. And there's also a story that the liners, the Cunard liners, particularly docking at Southampton, they would buy up unwanted goods from the ship, so things like napkins, tablecloths, maybe some cutlery, and they would hawk that around. And as I said, this was around about the turn of the century, the Boer War, and they'd come back and they started to sell that army surplus. And it was the army surplus that really got them into the shops as they became, and the stores, because what happened eventually, and this was on the back of the First World War, the 1418 war, was that the government set up a war office contract, and Millets won a contract to start to dispose of hundreds and thousands of items of unwanted army stock, and that might be clothing and equipment. In the equipment, I don't mean guns and things like that. I mean things like billy cans and water bottles, and they would start to sell these items as well as things like sheets and towels. And ultimately the family, and by then there were other branches of the family, how successful they were. Other branches of the family opened shops, and there was, and also depots, and they'd advertise war surplus stock. There would be newspaper adverts promoting war surplus stocks from the government at bargain prices and unbeatable prices, and basically it was that sort of commercial genius, if you like, of the Millets. Not just my great grandfather, but his brothers as well, and ultimately the next generation who were born in the UK. They got involved as in the business as well, and they spread their roots from the south coast, spreading out into the West Country, up into London, and then further north, and until they eventually covered the pretty much the major towns and cities in the UK. And what was interesting was that while they were a very close-knit and loving family, when it came to business, it was perhaps to an extent each man for himself, or each family member for themselves, because there was an unwritten rule that and a gentleman's agreement between the family members that one branch of the Millets couldn't open a store or a shop within 50 miles of another branch of the Millets, so sort of to make sure they didn't tread on each other's toes, which is how you got some members of the family moving from Southampton up to Leicester, for example. Others moved up to Birmingham, and then they spread out from there. So they'd sort of look at a map, see where there weren't any millet shops, and then go and open a millet shop there, and then so on, which is how they ended up going up into the northeast, the northwest, and indeed Scotland as well.
So it really wasn't one company. It was lots of different strands, lots of different family members, all expanding in their own areas.
Absolutely. In fact, all told, there were 14 different Millets businesses, all essentially selling the same goods, the same products. 13 of them were owned by members of the family, and then a 14th business was owned by a good friend of one of the second generation who got involved in the business. So ultimately there were something of the order of 300 shops trading as Millets at the sort of height of the business, which I think probably would be safe to say would be around the 60s and the 1960s, the 1970s, when sort of the Millets was at its zenith, as it were. As I say, 14 completely separate businesses, not perhaps a recipe for that would be used today, because but in the early days, the depots, they perhaps, because of the war contract that the Millets had from the government, that was perhaps an early form of central buying, dare I say. And so the branches, they would buy centrally off the War Office contract, and then disperse the goods out through the different Millets branches, and eventually from not just some of them selling ex-government stock, which was hugely popular in Civvy Street, and they then became into much more working men's clothes as well. So we took things like bib and brace and boots, working men's boots, and duffel coats and donkey jackets and protective clothing and waterproofs, and then ultimately into the great outdoors and camping.
So So there were 14 disparate businesses, but there was some kind of centralized buying.
I think that's what they probably,
yeah.
the Millets probably wouldn't recognise it, call it centralised buying, but I think today we would say that it was centralised buying. Yeah.
Yeah. But probably, I mean, presumably one of the entities had to do the deal and be responsible for the money. Okay, so let's look at some of these strands in a bit more detail. So Millets of Bristol, this was the first one, I think.
The Millets of Bristol was my great-grandfather's business was called J.M. Millet and Sons, and I sort of touched on it was Millet Brothers to start off with, and that was how it traded. They then, without getting too boring over dates, they opened in Bristol and then Southampton, and then different shops in different areas. Plymouth, there was another one, and a couple of others in the southwest. But then they moved shops in Bristol, and by then Max had married and had children, and he called the shop in Bristol J.M. Millet and Sons, despite his name being Israel Marcus. But it was but simply he didn't write English that well, and a sign writer mistook his I for a J, which is how it became J.M. Millet and Sons, and that was the name that appeared above the Bristol shop and other and 2 or 3 other shops. And the Bristol shop became quite synonymous in the business because, and this was how a number of them expanded, was Max and his sons, Michael, who was my grandfather, Monty and Sol, agreed that on the marriage of one of their sisters to a chap called Bernard Spielman, that she would receive the Bristol shop as a wedding dowry. And ultimately that business was expanded under Bernard Spielman's leadership. And then his son John joined the business to the extent where they became known as Millets of Bristol, and there were some 50-odd shops in that operation, all initially trading as J.M. Millet and Sons, and then they, as the business grew, they ultimately became Millets of Bristol, because that was where they were headquartered. So that was one branch of the family. Yeah.
So you've got one branch there that's turning into 50 branches.
Yeah,
and then you've got Mr. Bob.
Well, Mr. Bob was Bobby, or Robert Millet, to give him his birth name, and he was the oldest son of Moshe Millet, and he started in business in the 20s. The first shop, I think, was in Reigate, and then they opened a second shop in Redhill, both in Surrey. And he did that with his father. And but they became best known for a shop in Croydon, the junction of some people may know it as the junction of High Street and Surrey Street in Croydon, and it became known as Millet's Corner, and that existed there for some 90 years. Until 2017, but Mr. Bob, as he was known in the business, it wasn't a very initially. There was only 8 or 10 shops all around the Surrey area, but separately, Bobby's youngest brother Alan also, and there was 21 years difference, so almost a generation apart. Alan also came into the business, and following the death of their father, they expanded the business together, but ultimately Alan went a separate way and launched his own business, which was called AC Millet and Company Limited. But whereas Mr. Bob's business was Millets of St. Paul's, Millet Stores of St. Paul's, and he called it Millet Stores of St. Paul's because he had a warehouse in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But the two brothers went their separate ways, but ultimately they did come back together and formed it. I suppose you call it a united business. But Mr. Bob died sadly prematurely in 1971, if memory serves correct. But Alan went on to build what became Millet's Leisure, of some 150 millet shops, by far and away the largest of the family businesses. And he built the business by opening new shops in different towns and cities, but also buying up a number of different branches of Millets from his cousins and distant relatives. And it was Alan who built the business that became Millet's Leisure, that was ultimately the one that was bought by Sears, and numbered at the time some 150 millet shops dotted around the country.
So we'll come to Sears in a second. I think Alan coined a word, militization. What did he mean by that?
Yes, he did. Well, millets grew under his leadership through, and they expanded hugely with through the 60s and the 70s. And one of the big things was to use well-known entertainers of the day, people like Ken Dodd and stars from Coronation Street, Larry Grayson as well, Tony Blackburn, who was a Radio 1 DJ at the time, and others to open stores. And some of the one or two of the pictures in the book, it's difficult to believe the hundreds and hundreds of people that would turn out to see these celebrities open millet shops. But one of the things that Alan did was to buy up a rival called Wakefield's, that some listeners and some viewers might have heard of and might remember. And they were in many ways direct competitors, and that was where the word militization came from, because he declared that he was going to militize the Wakefield shops into millets, which is basically what he did, although perhaps the expansion was so quick and there was so much stock to sell that they bought from Wakefield's when they did the deal, that perhaps ultimately some would say perhaps that he overexpanded, and it was that led to him ultimately selling up.
And there's a story about Adam Faith wearing a jacket on the television, which I think is worth telling, because I think it shows just how far ahead of time of their time they were.
Yeah, well, millets would sell. I wouldn't want to say that they would sell anything, but they were very entrepreneurial, and that's a story that my third cousin Julian Millet told me, and in fact he kindly wrote a little piece in the book about it. But it was from a television program that I think was on ITV called Budgie, and Adam Faith, who was a pop idol at the time in the 60s and 70s, he was that starred in Budgie as a sort of flashy small time crook, and they saw Julian and a couple of the other guys that Julian worked with in Millets saw the program, and they rang, and they loved the jacket that he was wearing, and they rang up a couple of contacts in Birmingham and instructed them to bring samples to the company buying office, which in those days was in Twickenham in West London. And by the weekend, they'd had a few thousand jackets were on their way out to millet shops, and they pretty well sold out on the first Saturday. And yeah, that was so nothing. They copied. They copied what they saw on television. There's another quite nice story as well, that that I like, and that was Wellington boots were another staple line of millet shops, and in the 70s and 80s, the Reading Rock Festival was attracted 100,000, 150,000 people, and one year it absolutely poured with rain. Was fields with the campsites were flooded and all the rest of it, but Millets saw a great opportunity, and van loads of Wellington boots were dispatched to the Reading Rock Festival and sold out the back of trucks. And again, Millets showing their entrepreneurial skills, I think, taking advantage of the great British weather.
Well, I'm pleased to say Julian Millet is actually watching this webinar. So hello to you, Julian. And this is really inspiring because, now we have ASOS, which stands for As Seen on Screen. And to think that this was going on so many years before is really quite fascinating. Now, you alluded to the businesses beginning to consolidate. Alan Millet beginning to buy up some of the businesses from their cousins.
Yeah.
What was the story with Sears? When did they come on the scene?
Yeah, well, Sears was a conglomerate that owned numerous businesses across the country. Although they didn't, I think I'm right in saying that their name itself didn't actually appear on any properties. But Sears owned a lot of well-known stores across the UK, and some names that people might recall were people like Mappin and Webb. They owned Selfridges at one stage. They owned the William Hill chain of betting shops, shoe shops like Dulce's and Manfield and Saxon and Lillian Skinner as well, a department store. So they were a big organisation, and I think what Sears already owned. Millets of Bristol was bought by a company called Foster Brothers Clothing, that again some people might remember, and subsequently Foster Brothers also bought a couple of the other branches of family branches of Millets. And then what happened was that Sears acquired Foster Brothers itself. So that's how they initially owned some 60-odd Millet shops by acquiring Foster Brothers clothing, menswear clothing. And so based on that, they expanded in 1986 when they did a deal with Alan Millet to acquire what by then was called Millet's Leisure Shops for £12 million. And that was and they subsequently united the 150 Millet's Leisure Shops with something like 60 plus shops that they inherited with the Foster Brothers clothing deal, to give themselves some sort of 200 plus Millets branches. But even so, even then, there was still, I think, 4 branches of Millets, four separate strands of the family, that owned various shops, some 140 that were outside of the Sears ownership. So you've got one group of shops, one group of Millet stores owned by Sears, and then some 120, 140 owned by 4 other branches of the Millets family between them.
I don't know if you have any idea how Sears would have felt about not being able to own this brand in its entirety. And clearly the central buying would have been out the window by this point. Everybody would have been, I suppose, competing for stock on their own terms.
Yes, no, I don't know how Sears felt about that at all. I did, going back to my initial research, I did have some correspondence with the managing director of Millets, who was installed by Sears. But no, they saw very much at the time Millets as being, I think it's fair to say, a leisure. That by then it was very much a leisure chain, selling, but very much focused around camping and outdoors lifestyle.
So while all this was going on, there was another strand of the family building their own chain and also listing on the stock market.
Well, that's right, and I think what you're referring to there is Greenfields, or Greenfield Millets, as they were initially known, and that they were the one of those four separate businesses that I alluded to earlier, and they were expanding fairly rapidly, very much around London and the home counties, and they ultimately floated in 1970 on the stock market, and then ultimately they became known as Greenfields. They dropped the Millets name altogether, but perhaps interestingly, they weren't. That they were the second of the Millets family-owned businesses to float on the London stock market. The first was actually one called Millets Stores. They became known as Millets Stores 1928. The 1928 simply because that was when they floated on the stock market. So the stock exchange wasn't foreign territory to the Millets family, and in fact, Millets Stores 1928, I think, perhaps saw themselves as being the kings and queens of the Millets family-owned businesses, and then Greenfield Millets came along and floated, and then Millets Leisure Shops, which the Alan Millet business also floated, and that was in 1978. So over the years, you had three separate Millets businesses, all floated on the stock market.
Interesting. And it's been pointed out that Anthony Greenfield, who might be your second cousin, lives in Leeds.
Yeah,
we do know him. Okay, so workwear and fashion, these are unlikely bedfellows, and yet Millets did seem to capitalize on some fashion trends. Did anyone focus more on the fashion side, or particularly on the fashion side?
Well, I think sort of over the years, a number of the different branches focused on fashion, and just thumbing through the book, I've randomly found an advert from the Hampshire Telegraph in 1921 of Millets selling coats and shoes and jacket, menswear, really, but and to a greater or lesser extent, a number of the different shops got involved in selling fashion wear, but perhaps the one who took it to went further than anyone was ultimately the one that became the business that became known as the Peter Millet Group, and they started very much as selling outdoor wear and camping, but ultimately changed their trading name. Although the company retained Peter Millet Group as the holding company, they changed their trading name and became CJs. And Cheap Jacks was another name that they traded under, and they got very much into selling jeans and t-shirts and and various other fashion items in the 70s and or really even later than that, the 80s and the 90s, and they had some sort of 45, 46 shops in the south, largely in the south of the home counties and the south of England. And they'd sell sweatshirts and jeans and t-shirts, shirts, jogging. I suppose by then jogging pants had become a bit of a product, and that group came in and sort of filled to an extent the sort of gap between maybe hypermarkets and upmarket boutiques, and they existed until for some 40 odd years in various forms until the business collapsed in the 1990s.
Okay. Just a quick point to our audience. If you want to ask Ashley a question, please put it in the Q&A in the next few minutes, and we'll do our best to put that to him. We have a question from Holly in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the United States. Sears, was this the same company as Sears Roebuck, the department stores that were in the USA in the past?
No, it's not. It's a completely different organisation to the American one. Yeah.
Okay. So was there a point where all the businesses actually did come together, or the majority of them?
Well, yes, there was, and it's and that was really I suppose the leading up to where we are today was that ultimately the group of shops that were owned by Sears were then bought. There was a buy-in by a company called the Outdoor Group, and they owned the shops for a good few years, but they and then ultimately they sold out to a company called Blacks, which some people listening to this or watching this may be familiar with. Blacks is another UK high street chain of camping and outdoor shops. And in fact, Blacks, as Black and Edgington, were the original buyers of Millets stores 1928, back in 1970. But the Blacks had a somewhat checkered history over and without going into, sort of disappeared from the high street, but then another branch of Blacks was resurrected, and ultimately they bought the Greenfield branch of Millets, and as I say, the Outdoor Group then pulled the vast majority together and ultimately ended up owning all of Millets, which was really for the first time in the history of the company that Millets became under the single ownership of one organisation, and that was, as I say, a company called the Outdoor Group that was created specially to buy to business that was owned by Sears. And eventually that company, through one or two other corporate transactions, became under the control of Blacks. And then Blacks got into financial difficulties, and that's where JD Sports came in they've owned the business now for, I think this will be they've just marked 10 years of ownership, really. With they bought Millets from Blacks in 2012, and they also bought bought black shops as well. So they ended up with some 200 plus millet shops and about 98 black shops, which through consolidation and hemorrhaging, they whittled away and closed a number of them where there was some degree of duplication. And they've ended up with just under 100 today. And by all accounts are going strong, and they see the Millets brand as I say, trading as the outdoor, the sub brand is the outdoor store, which people might see on the fascia of the shops, and they're trading very strongly.
We're being asked about a gentleman, the late Ronnie Millet, who lived in Leeds. Is he part of the extended? You're not aware.
I'm not aware of that name. No.
Okay, thank you. So, where do you see the future of the brand? What do you think? What do you think is going to happen with it?
Well, I think that under JD Sports ownership, from when I spoke to Lee Bagnol, who's the managing director of JD Outdoor Group, his comment to me was that they see Millets as an outdoor icon in its own right. They view Millets. His comment to me was a much loved retailer that's been treasured by families, walkers and campers across the UK and beyond for generations. So with that kind of support from the hierarchy at JD Sports, today's owners of Millets, then the future must surely be bright. It's perhaps I mean, I should add, obviously, apart from the shops, there's a big internet presence as well, not forgetting the way that the high street shopping has changed from people going into shops to buying goods online. But I think it's if you said to me, well, what do you think your great grandfather would think of? Would he be surprised that Millets was still trading today? I think probably, undoubtedly, he would be hugely surprised, but perhaps delighted as well that the what started off as a trading from a market stall, from tally rounds and door to door, has become this, as I call it on the book, a British institution.
Well, in fact, Julian Millet has pointed out that Lee Bagnol has placed a copy of this book in every Millet store. So I think that tells you they are very much attached to the heritage of the brand.
Yes, that's right, and they were very generous in their support when I contacted them with writing, in terms of sort of providing comment and photographs as well. Not just, they did have a few historical ones as well that they were good enough, particularly of back catalogues, that they were good enough to pass on to me, and they also made a donation to the charity that I've asked people if they're interested in buying interested in having a copy of the book. Then I'm not asking people to buy it, but rather make a donation to a specific charity, which I know you're mentioning.
I'll mention it in a moment. So again, if you have questions for Ashley, please put them in the Q&A in the last few minutes we've got left. He is here, ready and willing to answer whatever you would like to ask. Julian says, I don't believe your great ancestor would be surprised. He'd have thought we would have had 1,000 shops by now. Sluggish expansion. Also a comment from David Marks. He says, I worked for Millets in Leeds from 1972 and remember it with great fondness. I think that there is something that comes out in the book about great care for staff and fostering them in a positive manner. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons the business was so successful.
I think that's right, and I think that the love that was shared by the owners for the staff comes through. And when I spoke to a number of employees, and they mentioned it in the book, the affection that they had for whether it was Alan Millett for Mr. Bob, for various Millets, and I mean, just a couple of perhaps anecdotes that are quite interesting. That one of the stories that Mike Gardner told me was that I should probably say that one of the things that Millets was noted for was windows packed with stock, and they also hung stock up on hangers outside and filled the pavements with goods. And but if Alan Millett arrived at a branch and saw a hole anywhere in the display, he would ask why, and add that we don't sell holes. And that perhaps some, and then they had to fill the gap in the window display, which was basically why the Millet's windows were absolutely chock-a-block full of stock.
I'm sure if they could have sold holes, they would. I mean, I think they weren't selling fittings out the shops.
Yes, well, there's one story in the book about some chap came in for a belt, and they didn't have a belt in stock, but they did have but they took off the loo chain and sold him the loo chain.
Absolutely fantastic.
And I don't know if there's time for what one other anecdote, but they bought a load of stock from ex-army stock, and apparently there was coats, underwear, gas masks, capes, all sorts of things worn by and they've been worn by troops in the trenches, and some of them had the blood and bullet holes still on them, but they still managed to find people who were willing to part with a bob or two for the goods.
Amazing. So, do you have any more stories to tell? Might you be writing another book?
Well, not another book about Millets, no. But I have written one more book, which didn't take me 30 odd years to write. But I'm a big. I've played a lot of tennis and still play a lot of tennis over the years, and I'm involved with the biggest tennis tournament in the UK, which is the Hunstanton Lawn Tennis Tournament, which is bigger than Wimbledon, and it was its centenary in 2020. So I wrote a history of the Hunstanton Tennis Tournament. And while COVID means that the tournament hasn't been held for the last 2 years, we're hoping to hold the 2022 tournament in August on the recreation ground in Hunstanton, and copies of the book will be available for sale, although you can buy it online through the Hunstanton tournament website.
Amazing. Well, good luck with that.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being our guest today. To say thank you, I'll send you a copy of some of my photographs. This is the Israeli Ambulance Service in action. It's a story of diversity and coexistence, so told in pictures. So I hope you'll enjoy that. If you want a copy of Ashley's book, it's really a fascinating read. You'll need to email him. The email is coming up in the chat, but it's also going to be on the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. And in lieu of a cover price, he asks for donations to Hope for Tomorrow. This is a charity that funds mobile chemotherapy units for NHS trusts. So fantastic that you're donating the books, and let's hope our viewers will want lots of copies and make donations accordingly. Now, before we leave you, just a few words about our future program. This coming Monday, we have Nadia Ragozina. She's speaking about her memoir, Worlds Apart. This is about two brothers born in Poland. One moves east to Russia, the other west to Switzerland. They never see each other again, but the family is reunited in the 21st century. Beautiful memoir, and I'm sure she will be very interesting. The following week, on the 28th of February, we partner with Leeds Litfest 2022 and welcome back the wonderful Jonathan Drury, who will be speaking about his book, Around the World in 80 Trees. Then on the 2nd of March, we have another Leeds Litfest event, a physical one this time at the Leeds Library, with Barrington Black speaking about his recent book, the Jewish contribution to English law. And finally, for now, on the 28th of March, we are partnering with the Jewish Historical Society of England again, Leeds branch, and we welcome Dr. Chelsea Sambells, who is speaking about the lesser known legacies of the Nuremberg trials. There is more coming. We have Howard Jacobson in the next few weeks, so watch this space for more details about that. Please do visit our website at millim.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter, and you will make sure you don't miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation on our website, which will help with the cost of providing these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Ashley Millett Martin. Once again, thank you so much, Ashley, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And looking forward to seeing all of you again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.